America, drawing on the practical lessons of land leasing that we saw in these agricultural cooperatives in Israel. And they convened a meeting later after coming back that invites just about every civil rights organization in the South at that time that had any interest in land reform. And some of the people who were the leaders in this first conversation, drafting the blueprint for what became the first community land trust, later went on to prominence. This is a picture of the very young John Lewis, who is in the U.S. House of Representatives today, his close friend of President Obama. So they created what we think of as the first community land trust in 1969, New Communities Incorporated. They bought over 5,000 acres of land right outside of Albany, Georgia, with the idea of basically creating an agricultural cooperative on leased land with a community base and community accountability and community governance structure for the CLT. And here I think were the key ingredients, because you're creating your own CLT here right now. Here I think are the key ingredients that were behind the creation of this community land trust, and that we found again and again as we created over 240 community land trusts in the United States. What are the key ingredients that keep coming up again and again? And first and foremost, new communities had champions. They had credible leaders who stood up front and said, we'll make this happen. Secondly, there was a compelling idea. This Ramdan movement in India, the model cities, the model villages in the United States, the garden cities in England. These was an idea of community-controlled land that fired the imagination of these people in the Deep South. If we could control the land, we could control the future of our neighborhood. In the Dudley Street neighborhood in Boston, the folks who supported that community land trust walk around with a button on their shirts and their jackets that says, take a stand, own the land. Because they came to the conclusion you couldn't trust zoning, you couldn't trust all the regulatory agreements, you couldn't trust government unless the community controlled the land, they couldn't control their future. Particularly in Roxbury, where the city had just moved the tracks, created light rail, and were putting massive investment into promoting gentrification in that neighborhood. These folks never forgot the lesson of SNCC. You've got to go out and knock on doors. You've got to educate, convince, persuade, and listen. Community organizing has been part of this model from the very beginning, and it still is a part of the model today. Koinonia Farm taught these folks that you can't just organize the beneficiaries. You can't just organize the people who are going to live on the land, live in the housing. You've got to look for a larger base of support around the estates, around the projects. You have to have community buy-in. So your community organizing is always broader than just the people who are going to benefit from the affordable housing and the affordable shops. Add a little bit of seed money for technical assistance and to get control of the first land. This is a picture later on of that fellow you saw that was all bloody in that picture. This is the attorney, C.B. King, was the brother of Slayer King. I think these ingredients come up again and again in almost every CLT that we've created in one way or the other. But there were some others that they did not have. The ones in red are the ones that they lacked. And 20 years after buying that land and creating the first community land trust, they lost the land. They lost the land because they did not have acquisition equity. Today, the gospel of the CLT movement is thou shalt not in debt buy land. Put the land in debt-free. Put it in a community ownership, debt-free. Use the public money to buy the land. They borrowed all their money to buy the land, and the debt service on on that land was so extreme that they spent the next 20 years paying off the debt service, and they never had any operating funds to pay for staff, because it was all going to the banks to pay for the money they had borrowed. And then finally, they couldn't go to the local banks and get debt on reasonable terms. In fact, the terms were so unreasonable, even from public lenders like the Farmers Home Administration, that years later, New Communities sued the federal government and said the reason we lost our land was because you guys didn't give us production credit on the same basis that you gave the white farmers in the Deep South. 2 years ago, they won, after all this time. So they won a $12 million settlement from the federal government. And New Communities still exist. So the same folks that created New Communities, Charles Sherrod, Shirley Sherrod, all these other folks that created that community, they lost their land. But now they got a $12 million pot of money from the federal government that they got because of discriminatory lending, and they are out there right now looking for land, hoping that New Communities is going to rise like a phoenix from the ashes. All right. There was a book written about New Communities before the sell-off of the land. It kind of spread the idea of the community land trust. And it had both of these elements in it, talking about it wasn't enough just to have this kind of interesting notion of ownership. You also had to have this organizational structure, which was accountable to the community, based in a larger social base of organizing and support. All right, the last elements, I'm actually coming to the end, if you can imagine this. The elements that were drafted on most recently are those with how we operate these organizations. What we do with the land and housing after we get it, after we sell off the buildings. And there was really some community land trusts started in 1978, 1981, where for the first time we had people taking the model, first time after New Communities, we had people taking the model and saying, well, you know what, New Communities, the real lesson of New Communities was we need to be getting the land, developing the house, and using these resources for the people who are the most disadvantaged. Between the formation of New Communities and this first community land trust in 1978 in Tennessee that was formed, most CLTs were sort of hippie communes, where they were middle-class folks in rural areas that just got a few units of housing. And they were kind of buying the land, creating a land trust as an exclusive enclave for their fellow travelers, people who believed in the same religion, the same politics, they wanted to live together, right? The group of land trusts created in 1978 in Tennessee, and then in eastern Maine, where the founders and the organizers said, you know, the first claim against our resources are the people that have no resources. And we're not just organizing these CLTs for a few privileged people who can sit on the land, we're organizing it for the entire community and for the people who don't yet have houses. Appropriately enough, the founder of these first two community land trusts in Tennessee and in Maine were both ex-nuns. This is a picture of Sister Lucy Poulin with a chainsaw. When you have nuns with chainsaws, be afraid, be brave. The first urban CLT was created in 1981 in Cincinnati. And I would say that it wasn't until this model finally made the leap from small rural enclaves into the inner city that we didn't really get traction. We had to show this model would also work in cities. We're an urban country. We're an urban country. And until we could test this model and prove the model downtown and in communities of color in the inner city and diverse communities, low-income communities, we couldn't get traction. Cincinnati was the first place where that happened. A lot of the people that started these community land trusts in the early 80s did come out, you know, they were nuns, they were pastors, there were rabbis, a lot of men and women religious who were worried about the displacement of their congregations. And the liberation, the language of the liberation theology of the day, they said what community land trust should be about